In Chapter 12, we're talking about communication in organizations. What we call organizational communication is a major area within the discipline of communication, and so definitely one worth looking into if you're interested. It's one you can continue with and do a lot of work with. It's also very useful post-graduation. People seem to understand some of the skills you pick up more so than they do from some of the other areas of communication. Granted, I love them all, just putting that out there. So before we move into there, let's talk about personal relationships. Quick brain refresh. Is this information in your notes or in your head? And if not, why not? So, what are the three dominant dialectical tensions experienced within romantic relationships? If you can name the ones external, you should be proud of yourself. What are four common ways to manage them? Also think about which is ideally the best, but also the most difficult. I briefly mentioned it in the lecture. And what are the four stages of the cycle of intimate partner violence? As we talk about organizational communication, it's crucial to note that communication is central to organizations and actually constitutes their cultures. So when we talk about organizational culture, what we're really talking about is the communication that's happening. So think back to the first or second chapter. We talked about how communication is constitutive. What we mean by this is that communication constitutes or creates or constructs our understanding of the world. It may not construct the tangible things, right? That's more atoms and molecules, but it does create how we understand those things, what they mean to us, and how we interact with others about them. Right? So communication actually constitutes, creates the culture of organizations. Organizational culture is defined on page 246 as ways of thinking, acting, and understanding work that are shared by members of an organization and reflect an organization's identity. An organization is structure, right? Structure of different types. And so one of the crucial pieces here is that there's different types of networks that form that structure, both formal and informal. We'll see that come up again in a moment. Largely, I'm going to just review some key concepts from this chapter, and so if you have more questions, do let me know. But there's also a large list of things in the additional resources because this is such a large area, and it's one that a lot has been written about, both from communication theorists and outside. So here on the right, we have an image that demonstrates some of the pieces of the puzzle of organizational culture. And some of the key concepts coming out of the chapter include vocabulary, stories, standardized practices, and structures. So often, vocabulary within organizational cultures, we see concepts such as masculine language. And I want you to remember from the Communicating Culture chapter that when we talk about masculine versus feminine language, we're not actually talking about gender. Unfortunately, this is what the researchers chose to name particular styles of communicating. So masculine language, remember, is more of that win-lose, very assertive, very let's get the job done now, based on report rather than rapport. So you're not as concerned with relationships, you're more concerned with final outcome, product-wise and income-wise. So that's where we see masculine language come in. But we see it in some of the metaphors that are used and just the style of communicating. We also have hierarchical language, and so who is everyone and where do they fit within the organization? Are you a first year, a sophomore, a junior, a senior, a super senior? And what do you gain from being that much more knowledgeable about the system? Where would you put a transfer student? Faculty versus staff and administration, all of them have very strict hierarchies. And in fact, within the group of people that you call professors, you have anyone from full professor to associate professor to assistant professor, lecturer, teaching professor, instructor, adjunct, graduate student, right? And so even if you call all of them professor, they are very different places within the hierarchy. One that's not listed in the book, but I wanted to make sure we made a note of, are things like metaphors and aphorisms. And I want you to bear in mind how culturally specific they are. So, for instance, a friend of mine is Japanese, he works in a US company, and he actually ended up buying a book about metaphors used within US companies in order to try and make sense of it. For instance, his boss was signing things peace out, and it took him a little while to figure out what that meant. It also took him a while to figure out that his boss was using a very sarcastic tone in email, which was not something that he was used to or had seen before. So bear in mind that when we don't speak literally, that metaphors are very culturally based. And so if you have a diverse workforce, that is something that can get in the way of communication. We have a lot of stories we tell in organizations. Corporate stories are the stories the corporation tells about itself. So when you show up to orientation, it's the story you're told about the values and how that corporation came to be, how that organization has moved forward, right? So when you showed up and school told you, here's where our campus is, here's why we are who we are, here's our founder, here's why our colors are what they are, right? All of those things, those are corporate stories. We also have personal stories, and personal stories is when you're talking to colleagues and you talk about your personal lives. This is what's going on outside of work. This is who I am as a person. Compare this to collegial stories, and collegial stories are between colleagues, but they're about work. So for instance, you start a job and someone says, hey, with manager Sam over there, um, this is what you need to know, whereas with Terry, I wouldn't plan on getting away with XYZ. Right? So collegial stories are ones that are told about work, but by colleagues. This is kind of the grapevine stuff, right? The back room talk that helps you know where to cross your T's and dot your I's and what your managers value most, things like that, right? So corporate stories and collegial stories in particular are ones that help employees all get on the same page and to share the values of the culture. We also have standardized practices within organizational culture. So we have rites and rituals. Now, rites and rituals are ones that confuse a lot of folks, and so the next slide has more about rites, and I've also included some more explanatory stuff in the additional resources for you to take a look at. In general, rites are those moments that mark a passage in most cases, right? There are these very significant moments that kind of mark change for individuals or for organizations, whereas rituals are regular formal occurrences. So, for instance, where would graduation fall, right? University graduation. So it's actually going to depend where you are in the organization. For students, this is very much a rite as you move from one stage of life to another, right? You wear the fancy robes, you get the diploma to hang on your wall. This is a rite of moving forward and of changing, right, from undergraduate to graduate. For faculty, however, graduation is a ritual. It happens every year. It actually happens a couple times a year, right? Most folks even own the robes that they wear because they wear them so often, right? There's a routine that you go through. There's expectations associated with it, and it's a ritual of the organization for faculty and for staff compared to a rite for students. And so hopefully that helps distinguish between the two, but I'll give you some more example of rites on the next slide. And then structures, roles we talked about in group communication. So we see that also happening in organizations. And remember, you have both the formal and informal roles. Formal being this person is named as the boss. This person is the middle management. We don't actually call it that, but like assistant general manager or whatever. But then we also have the informal roles of kind of who picks up leadership when no one's assigned it, right? Who's that person who kind of lets everybody know that a birthday's coming up or, right, keeps the social aspect going. Rules, we have both formal and informal, right? Also implicit and explicit. Those were covered pretty thoroughly in other chapters. Policies are formal guidelines put together by the organization, and this is important, that are meant to demonstrate the values and the vision and the culture of the organization, right? So for instance, our policy is that we don't call them customers, we call them guests. And what does it say about our values that they're guests instead of customers, right? So policies are things that are meant to demonstrate the values. And communication networks. So as I mentioned, we have both formal and informal. Formal communication networks are, here's the chain of command that you should go through. Informal networks are, Here are the folks you talk to about what's going on, and you try and figure out more information about a project, all those pieces. So we have both formal and informal, but also think about the actual mediums that we use in order to communicate with one another, especially if is it across a cubicle? Is it international? Is it email? Is it texting? Is it, face to face? So some companies feel very strongly about how their networks interact with one another. So I mentioned about rights. Hopefully this is another way that helps you distinguish. And so there's some different types of rights. For instance, a rite of passage, a rite of enhancement, a rite of renewal, a rite of integration. And here we actually see some examples of what this right is, but also more importantly, what's the purpose of having a right such as this? So I think this is a good way to kind of think about what is a right, what's an example of a right, and why does it matter, right? What does it do for us? Why do companies have these things? Why do organizations have these things? So when you think about applying concepts, remember that there are stories of all kinds told. And so on your campus, what are some of the organizational stories? What about collegial? What have you heard about other professors, right? That would be a collegial story. What about personal stories that you tell, right? Is it with other students? Is it with faculty? Is it with staff? Think about what kinds of rites and rituals have existed in a company you've worked for, right? Write down some examples other than the graduation example that I gave you. And consider what are some policies at your work, right? Can you identify the communication networks that you use at work? So remember that the purpose here for us is to think about how do we apply these concepts in real life? How do we step beyond the textbook, beyond the quiz, and say, okay, these concepts matter. How are they playing out in my life? Unfortunately, one of the things that also happens at work is bullying. Uh, Sexual harassment is also a negative aspect of work, and so that has a very particular legal definitions. Um, but bullying at work can also be is, is different legally than sexual harassment, but is important and worth pursuing because some people forget that it exists. So we talked about power and control and negative relationships in an earlier chapter. Uh, but it also happens in the workplace. And in fact, if you Google emotional abuse, you are more likely to find it about work than you are about personal relationships. And I speak from experience trying to find the information. Uh, Last time I checked was probably a year or two ago. So feel free to double check and let me know what you find. But it's far easier to find pieces about emotional abuse at work, which really demonstrates how much it is happening. So we see both indirect work bullying, but also direct work bullying. And this can be done by coworkers, this can be done by supervisors, right? And it's important that if this starts happening, it's crucial that you document what is happening, when it's happening, what's going on. I'll tell you a story about workplace bullying. And my sister was what we call, or what she called, a human capital consultant, which means when there was change happening in organizations, her company was contracted and she went on site, usually with a small team, and said, okay, what change is happening? Okay, you're getting a new system in to bring all your international locations under one roof. You're going through a major merger. You're going through a major layoff and selling off, right? So what do we need to communicate to employees? What values need to be espoused in that? How are we going to demonstrate these things? Since they would go on site, talk with everybody, right, and put together materials to help companies move through change. So in one example, she was on location for 7 to 8 months, and it was a very small team. It was her and one other colleague at her same level, and they had a supervisor. And even though they worked within the company, and producing materials for the company, their supervisor did not let them present their product to the client. And they had to work very hard and have a lot of conversations with him and superiors above him to get him to allow them to present their own product to the client, right? So to take, here are all the slides, here are all the recommendations we've put together. Now we're going to show them to you in a meeting, because previously he had been taking their product and he was the only face of the team for the client, right? But they needed client reviews and they wanted to be able to work directly with the clients that they were making recommendations for. So he finally agreed to let them be in the presentations and made sure that he previewed everything that they had prepared. He critiqued it. His critiques went something along the lines of, didn't they make you take English at your college? Right? So he very consistently teased and insulted and spoke down to them. Um, Fortunately, to the point where basically every conversation that either she or her coworker ended up having with her supervisor, they immediately started transcribing on the computer as he spoke to them, because it had become such a negative workspace, and it was so consistent that he was just using these small things that added up and added up. So he checked over all of their product. They started going into meetings with the client, and even though he had previewed and approved everything that they showed the client, in the meeting, in front of clients, he would question everything that they said and everything that they presented, and undermine them in front of the client every time they presented. Right? And it was such a consistently negative atmosphere that as soon as her contract was up, she left that job. Right? She left the company because it was not worth staying at despite the benefits that she received and despite efforts to change the situation by talking to her work counselor and talking to superiors. Nothing changed. It is worth noting that she did have a work counselor, and increasingly more and more big firms are having mentors and counselors within the company, someone who's not necessarily your supervisor, but in order to help you learn the organizational culture and to maneuver that organizational culture while you're a newer, younger employee. Because especially for large firms, otherwise people get lost, and organizations put a lot of money into training, and if they can retain employees, then they want to. So bullying at work is unfortunately similar to how we talked about power and control in personal relationships. We also have a power and control wheel for the workplace. So notice that some of the examples here: emotional control, isolation, economic control, tactics, restrictions, management privilege, overt actions, all of these list examples for things that can become workplace bullying. Overall, organizational culture is how an organization thinks about itself and it acts its identity and espouses its identity. So I have some examples here. There's an image of Google, of IBM, and Starbucks. And they all have multiple major locations. This is just one image from one location, but it's interesting for me how this one image does demonstrate some of the company differences of these three locations. So many different organizations are becoming very well known for their culture and very well known for courting young employees with cool benefits. Right? So we've heard of the Google campus, right? And large Google campuses are the ones where you can nap, you can do your laundry, you can eat, you can go to the gym. Often people date within their company. And really the company makes it so you don't need to leave because there's so many options there. But when you think about the flip side of that, you realize that what it also means is that people don't need to leave and therefore put in more work, right? So you're getting more work out of employees because they don't need to do the errands that they would otherwise. It all just happens at work, right? So I've given you some bright, shiny examples, but as you think about organizational culture, think about both big and small companies. Where do you want to work? Why do you want to work there? What about that culture? Sometimes it takes some trial and error, but it's important to think about, what do you value in a workplace? Right? What do you gain out of it? When you think about the options available to you after graduation, how do you measure and weigh them against each other? Right? Does it really come down to just the salary? Are there other benefits? Does it mean quality of life? Does it matter where you're living, how you're working with people, if at all? Right? So consider all of these things and consider how an organization is embodying its culture What are its communication practices and how would you fit into that?